Welcome. My name is Pastor Brandon, and if you're joining us this morning, it's so good to have you with us. We are entering into week 3 of a series called Money Matters. And for the past few weeks, we've been looking at the ways that we can relate better, particularly to personal finances. But today I want to zoom out and begin looking at how we relate with our whole lives to our money, to our wealth, and to all the stuff we have. We've learned over the past few weeks that having a spirit of generosity is the antidote to greed, the greed that's so prevalent in our culture. We've learned that our inner longing drives us to seek more money, more possessions, but that inner longing can't actually be filled by any of that. It can only be filled, we've learned, by God. Today, I want to ask us to begin to think about what it would look like if we took these principles of generosity and applied them to our whole lives. What would it look like if you and I embodied generosity as a way of living? What would it look like if we lived sacrificially? What would it look like if we lived our lives with a deep connection to God? Jesus tells us a story you might have heard of, that comes from Mark 12, verses 41 through 44. It goes something like this. Sitting across from the offering box, Jesus observed how the crowd tossed money into the collection. Many of the rich, they were making large contributions. One poor widow came up and put in 2 small coins, a measly 2 cents. Jesus called his disciples over and said, "The truth is that this poor widow gave more in the collection than all of the others put together. The others gave what they'll never miss. She gave extravagantly what she couldn't afford. She gave her all." Before I explain the story, let's talk about the context here for a second. In first century Palestine, the temple, it was the center of Jewish life. It was the center of worship. It was the center of commerce, and it was also a government central point. All around the temple, there were signs and symbols of ostentatious wealth. All around the temple, there were symbols of inequity and of power imbalance. In the first century, if you were born into a poor family, you had little hope of ever climbing out of poverty into some higher economic bracket. The religious leaders in the first century were among some of the wealthiest people in the society. And they were also really tightly knit with the political powers of their day, the political powers of Rome. And being close to the political powers, that ensured that they would only gain more wealth. In this culture, the poorest people tended to cling most tightly to faith in God. Actually, that's the case in our culture too, isn't it? Have you ever noticed that those who tend to have the strongest faith tend to be those who have the least in this world? They're the people who often have the hardest lives. There's some wisdom there that I want to explore in just a little bit. But the context that the story that Jesus tells us is this culture of inequity and power imbalance and great wealth disparity. And he also gives us another hint into the context of this woman he's telling us about. The text tells us she's called a poor widow. She knows that she's already economically disadvantaged. But what we know about the first century is that if you were a woman who lost your husband, that you were left out for dead, basically. If you didn't have family around you, if you especially didn't have children, if you were a widow, you were utterly hopeless in society. No means of income, no means of support. In this passage, however, we learn something about this widow's inner resolve. It seems that she doesn't have any family. She only has 2 cents to give. Her economic status is really bad. And yet something within this widow leads her to go to the temple court and give everything that she has. She's without a husband, without a family, with little opportunity ever to make more money. And just living every day for this widow was a difficult feat. And it's in this context that Jesus tells us this poor widow enters the temple court surrounded by wealth, surrounded by people who had wealth upon wealth upon wealth and who were giving off the top of their wealth to keep this system going. And she walks up boldly to the offering box and she gives 2 cents. She does this, and the rich religious leaders around her were probably looking at her with mocking pity. Folks around her were contributing thousands of dollars. Here she comes with 2 cents. If I asked a person who gave a larger contribution, if I asked you in this room who gave the larger contribution, someone who gave $2,000 or someone who gave 2 cents, our mind naturally jumps to the answer, of course, the person who gave $2,000. On the surface, that seems more generous, right? But Jesus flips the script. He says to his disciples, the truth is the widow gave more to the collection than all of the others combined. All of the others gave what they will never miss. She gave extravagantly what she couldn't afford. Jesus says she gave her all. Do you see what Jesus did there? He said the wealthy people in the temple, those whose dollars amounts were higher, they gave what they would never miss. So if they were making $100,000 a year, giving $2,000 wasn't going to impact them very much, would it? In this story, the wealthy people in the temple were likely very wealthy. So we're talking about our modern day millionaires. These people who were writing these checks in the temple, it didn't mean very much to them. They were able to give and it would never impact their day-to-day life. They were generous to onlookers, but their heart wasn't very generous. But this woman, whose bank account was likely negative, gave all that she had. She gave her last 2 cents. Or as Jesus says, she gave her all. She's truly more generous than everyone else combined. She gave despite of the reality that the 2 coins she was giving was likely going to be misused by the religious leaders around her. She gave knowing that these religious leaders were oppressing her, were the very reason that she was in the state that she was in. But she gave nonetheless. In fact, biblical scholar Craig Keeler notes this. The temple sported ostentatious wealth, and its officials would probably waste this widow's money. But this powerless woman acts in good faith and is the greatest giver in God's sight. The truth is that the religious leaders, they didn't need her 2 cents. They likely scoffed at her 2 coins. But the deeper truth that this widow seems to be operating from is this, that this giving had nothing to do with money at all. The money was a symbol of a life surrendered to God. As Jesus teaches in Matthew 6:21, where your money is, your heart will be also. This widow's giving not because she thinks her money is going to make a difference, but because she knows that money is perhaps the greatest indicator of where her faith lies, where her heart is at. Her faith is in God. She literally gives everything that she has because she believes that God is her provider. Her coins, they represent her life. They represent her heart. Here she is with literally no money, no family, no one to take care of her. Her giving is a bold statement to those who have eyes to see, who have ears to hear. She's declaring that God is all that she needs. And that kind of faith causes Jesus to declare this woman more generous than all of the givers in the temple combined. In the Christian tradition, there's this word, sacrament. Has anybody ever heard the word sacrament before? If you're from a Catholic tradition, you've probably heard it a lot more than in our kind of tradition. But the word sacrament literally refers to a ritual that expresses a channel of God's grace. Traditionally, Christians have recognized anywhere between 2 and 7 sacraments. Sacraments like communion, which we do every week, and the sacrament of baptism are universally recognized. These 2 rituals are outward symbols of an inner reality. We do something external to express our internal commitment to God. Today, I want to add a sacrament that no other Christian tradition acknowledges, but we're going to start to acknowledge here. That giving is also a sacrament. It's an outward symbol of an inward spiritual reality. If our hearts are postured in full trust and reliance on God, then we should feel free to give generously and cheerfully without reservation, because inwardly we know that God is our provider. Amen. God is going to show up. Amen. But if our hearts are postured towards idolatry, towards trusting and loving money and possessions more than we trust and love God, then giving is going to be hard for you. We're going to be reluctant when we give. We're going to be cautious when we give. We're going to grip tightly to our stuff instead of opening our hearts and our hands to trust God. Our giving is a sacrament because it shows where our hearts are at. If they're postured towards God or if they're postured elsewhere. Let's do an experiment for a second. Put yourself in this scenario. You walk into a room and Jesus is standing there. And there is also your checkbook and your bank statement. Jesus is going to look over your bank statement and through your checkbook to see where your money goes. I hear some little laughter around the room. A little scared. Starbucks, amen. Me too. Would your spending, would where your money goes reflect a posture of generosity? Would it reflect a life centered on God? Or would it reflect selfishness, greed, hedonism, and self-pleasure? Maybe an addiction to Starbucks. No judgment. That's a hard thing to think about, isn't it? Because I don't know about you, but as my bank statement stands right now, I don't know that I want Jesus looking at it. And if that's the case for you, the question you should ask is why? The question I should ask is why? Why are we more willing to spend our money in other places than give to the work of God in the world? Why are we more willing to cling to our money and to our own self-pleasure than to be blessings to people who need it far more than we do? Why are we more willing to cling to stuff instead of to trust in the God who made us? Why are we reluctant to help those in need around us when we know that all of our needs are already met? If we truly believe that God is our loving provider, then why are we so afraid to release stuff into his hands? These are hard questions, but they're essential questions, not just for us to think about as a church in this capital campaign season, but as we think about our faith in general. Is our faith in stuff, or is it in God? Are you giving your stuff, your money, your time in sacrificial ways, or are you just giving on the surface? Are you giving in a way that makes it so that you don't need God, that you don't need to rely on God? Because Jesus says in the stories that it's not what we give, but what we keep that God is interested in. The widow gave everything. She gave her all. She trusted that even in her lowly state, God would show up and provide. She didn't care about the results of her giving. She didn't care about what happened to her gift. For her, her money was a symbol of where her heart was. She was expressing that she relied on God. But remember that I said today, I wanted to challenge us more than just about our financial giving. Again, money is a symbol. It reflects where our hearts are at. And chances are that if we're stingy with our finances, we're also going to be stingy with our time and our talents. Greed doesn't only infect our bank accounts. It's a disease that infects every area of our life. And there are 3 T's that all of us have: our time, our treasure, and our talent. And God demands that we're generous with all 3 of these. If we have a posture of reliance on God and begin to embrace the sacrificial way of Jesus, we'll be willing to live and give freely of our time, talents, and treasures for God's purposes and for God's glory. Listen to what Paul writes in Romans 12, 3-8. I'm speaking to you out of deep gratitude for all that God has given me, and especially as I have responsibilities in relation to you. Living then, as every one of you does, in pure grace, it's important that you don't misinterpret yourselves as people who are bringing goodness to God. No, God brings it all to you. The only accurate way to understand ourselves is by what God is and by what God does for us, not by who we are and what we do for him. In this way, we're like various parts of a human body. Each part gets its meaning from the body as a whole, not the other way around. The body we're talking about is Christ's body of chosen people. Each of us finds meaning and function as part of this body. But if you chopped off a finger or cut off a toe, that wouldn't amount to much, would it? Since we find ourselves fashioned together and form miraculously as parts of Christ's body, let's go ahead and be what we're made to be without enviously or pridefully comparing ourselves to each other or trying to be something we aren't. If we preach, let's preach God's message and nothing else. If you help, just help. Don't take over. If you teach, stick to your teaching. If you're encouraging guidance, be careful that you don't get bossy. If you're in charge, don't manipulate. If you're called to give aid to people in distress, keep your eyes opened and be quick to respond. If you work with the disadvantaged, don't let yourself get irritated or depressed by them. Keep a smile on your face. In this passage, Paul tells us we are part of Jesus' incarnation in the world, Christ's body. And he says that all of us have a part to give, a part to play. He convicts us by saying that our gifts, they're given to us by God. We're not giving God anything. Everything good we have comes from God. It doesn't originate with ourselves. Paul tells us our time, talent, and treasures, they all come from God, and they should be used in reliance and for God's purposes. He says that if we give it to the church, to the work of God, we need to be careful not to pat ourselves on the back as if we're doing something amazing for God. The point of giving isn't to be recognized for your giving. The point of serving isn't to be recognized for your serving. No, Paul says, you can't take responsibility for any of it because you didn't create any of it. He says God brings it all to you. Church, your money, it's not yours. It's God's. Your talents and your gifts, they're not yours. They're God's. Your time and your energy, it's not yours. It's God's. You could have none of those things unless God graciously granted them to you. So as St. Paul says, the only accurate way to understand ourselves is by what God has done for us, not by what we do for him. You think that you're all that in a bag of chips? Think again, honey. All the good things you have comes from God. They're gifts from God, and they should be used for God's purposes in the world. This is why James says in James 1:17, every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father above. Every gift you have, your time, your talents, and your treasures, they are gifts. They're given to you from God. And when you use them, it's important that you use them in humble service to God. And know that when you're giving, you're not giving God anything. God doesn't need anything. Rather, your sacrificial giving is an expression of your gratitude for what God has given in your life. Our giving is meant to be an act of worship for all that God has given to us, not a selfish reveling in what we give to God. Giving is not what we do. It's a fundamental way of living. There are many people in our world that have lived in a posture of radical self-sacrifice. I'm sure you could name many. Famous examples: Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela. People who were willing to put others before themselves, even when they were at the top of power or wealth or influence. That's the kind of person God is calling us to be. This woman, this widow, was willing to give generously to God, though it was more than she could afford, because she put her faith in God before her own needs. The whole point of this series, and the whole point of the nearly 2,000 verses in the Bible dealing with money, is this: that it has little to do with money at all. It has to do with what your money represents. It has to do with how you're living your life, in reliance on God or on yourself. How are you relating to others? Do you believe that you're a self-made man or woman? Do you believe that you deserve what you have? Do you believe that you're better than the people around you? Is it easy to give what you give? These are the hard questions that I hope you'll take a moment to reflect upon and really think through. Because if the answer is yes to any of these, then we have some work to do. We're not living like Jesus. We're not living with sacrificial reliance on God. And our lives will have suffering in them because of it. Because being generous blesses the one who is giving far more than blesses the one who receives, doesn't it? This is why Jesus is quoted as saying in Acts 20:35, "It is more blessed to give than it is to receive." When you learn to give sacrificially and generously, your life gets better. You feel freer. Your joy increases. And if you don't believe me, then why is it always true that the countries that have far less than we do have far higher levels of joy and satisfaction? And why is it in the country that has the most wealth and power and pleasure than any country in the history of the world has more depression, suicide, and suffering? This week I was scrolling through Facebook, as I'm sure you were too, and I came up on, you know how it tells you your memories? And it showed me this picture from 5 years ago when I was in India, and you probably can't see it very well. But what it is there's 3 little children dancing in the street and waving at us as our bus passed by. What was striking to me is that here we are in our bus driving through, expecting to go and see poor India, the suffering of India. But when I was there, what I realized, and what so many people have noted before me, was there was a deeper sense of joy and satisfaction in the day-to-day life of the Indian people than we had as Americans. Because the truth beneath the surface is stuff doesn't make us happy. It just doesn't. Your talents, they can't make you happy in and of themselves. It's when we share our talents that our joy increases. I'm a writer. I'm writing a book, and I certainly enjoy it, but writing is a painful exercise when I'm sitting alone in front of a computer and nobody's around, and I'm pouring hours driving myself to this desk just to write. But when that book goes into the world, when people begin to interact with it, when I get to share it with others, that's what fuels me and motivates me to keep doing what I do. That's what gives me the most joy. I don't write for myself. I write to give to others and hopefully to help others. Because every gift that we have must be shared. Our time, our talent, and our treasures. And in order to cultivate that spirit of generosity, we need to begin working with how we posture our heart before God. We need to constantly be reminding ourselves that God is our provider. God has given us all the good that we have, and therefore we should posture ourselves in humility before him. Because God is the generator of all good. All good comes from God and is a gift from God, and God's supply of goodness, church, never runs low. When you begin to believe that and live like that, you begin to have radical generosity. You begin to love with abandon. You begin to walk with ridiculous joy because you know that God provides all that you need. And you get to be the channel through which God provides and speaks and blesses others. But it all comes down to our posture of heart. Are we prideful or are we humble? And by the way, humility isn't beating yourself up because of how small or broken you are. No, true humility is recognizing the greatness within yourself and realizing it doesn't originate from yourself. It's realizing that the greatness within you finds its origin in God. It's a gift from God. And therefore, you're free to use that gift to bless others. You give without worrying about what you get in return. Because God is the one that's keeping score. God is the one that's providing. God is the owner of the gifts that you have. Mission Gathering, each and every one of us is blessed in so many ways. And God is calling our church in this season into reflection, into asking ourselves to examine our hearts and ask, where are we putting our hope and our trust? Is it in God? Or is it in your money, your talents, and your time? Are we moving day by day into a posture of radical generosity and joyful giving? Are we giving our all? Or are we holding back in fear instead of living in faith? Do we believe that we are in control of our lives? That we deserve what we have? Are we gripped by greed or are we freed by generosity? The freedom that God offers to us in the person of Jesus is a costly freedom. A freedom that comes through sacrifice. The abundant life that God offers us comes at a cost. Our whole lives must be laid before God, saying, all of it is yours. Use it for your glory. It's my prayer that each of us, as we intentionally move into this season, will begin to let go of our grip on stuff, on our talents, on our time, and learn to be generous in every area of our lives. Because in so doing, our faith will grow, our lives will deepen, and we will be transformed more and more into the image and the likeness of Jesus. I believe that God is speaking to many of our hearts today. Don't resist. Take a step of faith. Trust God. And watch, just watch, how your world is transformed for the better. So what do you say, Mission Gathering? Are you ready and willing to take a step of faith with me? Are you ready and willing to give up our grip on the things of this world and trust God to be our provider? Can I hear a better yes than that? Okay. I want to invite our music team down because for our meditation today, we're going to do something a little bit different. David, our worship minister, has prepared a song that reflects on this scripture story. And so as we posture our hearts in meditation, I want you to listen to this beautiful song. Listen to the words of this widow who gave her all. And listen for what God might be speaking to you today. But before we do that, will you pray with me? God, you are the generous parent who desires to give good to your children. Would you help us follow this widow's example and give our life to you? Surrender every area to you. Trust in you fully as the source of our satisfaction and of our provision. God, you have blessed us in so many ways. Help us to use these blessings to bless the world around us. And would you help our faith and reliance on you as individuals and as a church to continue to grow? Be our Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. We ask all this in Jesus' name.